Welcome to Voice of San Diego. At home, it's June 8th, 2020. It's Monday. Again, Monday, June 8th, 2020. If you're having trouble keeping track, I can understand why. We have a lot going on in the city of San Diego and in the region and in the country, and we are here for all of it with you. I'm going to be joined today, the special guest, the city attorney of the city of San Diego, is Mara Elliott. Mara is, of course, the elected city attorney. The city is one of only a few cities that has an elected city attorney. It's an independent office, and it serves two major functions in the city. So it provides legal guidance and legal coverage for the city. You know, it's their lawyer for the city. But then the office also does prosecutions for the city of misdemeanors. So if you commit a misdemeanor within the city of San Diego, that's the office that handles that. There's a lot of misdemeanors, a lot of different types. Most misdemeanors across the rest of the county are handled by the district attorney, the county district attorney. So we've got a lot to talk about there. And then I'm going to take some time afterward to go over some of the news of the day and a few announcements to take in. But without further ado, I'd like to welcome Mara Elliott. Mara, hello. How are you?
Hi, Scott. I'm good. Thank you. How are you?
Good. Thanks for joining us. Are you also quarantined still at home?
I am. I'm doing the city attorney and mother homeschooling two boys thing.
Yeah.
And tomorrow's the last day of school, so I think they're going to make it through, and we'll progress to the next year and see how we do.
Yeah. So we've been all my friends here on the stream have been talking a lot about schools, what's going to happen to schools. We hear that San Diego Unified is going to meet June 16th to talk about what they're going to do for next year, maybe have a draft proposal out. So we will be, maybe we'll have to go live and track that conversation. That could be fun. My kid just finished his Zoom, last Zoom of the day, and jumped up screaming. He was excited about that last one of the year. So I wish I could finish my Zooms for the year. All right, let's get into it. We've got a lot to talk about. I was just telling the followers of the stream about your role as city attorney. You were elected in 2016. You're going for re-election right now.
Correct. Right.
There's a lot of talk about election. We're going to get into that, about the elected city attorney. Let's start first, though. You do prosecute misdemeanors in the city of San Diego. We did a story last week about some of the protests and in particular, the declaration of unlawful assembly. Unlawful assembly is when a police officers controlling a demonstration decide that it has crossed some kind of line and now needs to be cleared out or moved significantly. A lot of people were arrested under that particular violation. That is a decision now that goes to your office to prosecute as a misdemeanor. Is that something you've been studying now, getting up to speed on? I'm not sure there's been a lot of unlawful assemblies since you started.
Yeah, the issue has been arising from time to time because we were seeing protests during COVID-19. And I have tried to make very clear to the public that I am a supporter of the right to protest. I think very meaningful results come from peaceful protests. What we take seriously would be if somebody loots or batters somebody. But otherwise, I have no interest in prosecuting peaceful protesters. I think what they have to say more than ever needs to be heard right now, discussed, and they are bringing about very good changes, long-awaited changes for San Diego.
Mm-hmm. Where does that line cross, do you think, when an assembly? That's one of the things I found fascinating was the unlawful assembly thing. Feels like it can be kind of capriciously enforced. It could be a major assault on police, or it could be as much as a cardboard sign or a bottle flying over them. What do you think the line should be as police? I think we've got to get a little bit better as a society, both in handling protests and in kind of recognizing that they're going to be part of our landscape for a long time.
Yeah, you raised a really good point. I'm not sure that we've seen protests at this magnitude. And I suspect there's a bit of a learning curve there. But what I'm looking for is serious conduct where somebody is hurt or a business window has been broken and things are being stolen. With every protest case, you have to look at it on its own merit. and try to figure out, was this just a miscommunication? Was this somebody who intended to violate the law by doing something serious? But we focus our resources in the office on serious crimes, domestic violence, elder abuse, child abuse. Again, peaceful protests are not a focus for my office. And I encourage people to say what they need to say, because I think now more than ever, you've got elected officials who are listening and responding.
When you take those cases of the unlawful assembly violators, can you give them any message like it's going to be all right, or you're going to review each one, I'm sure, and decide, huh?
Yeah, we have to review each one. And there are, I don't want someone to have a record unnecessarily. So we have a lot of mechanisms in our office to deal with the issue based on severity. For instance, like on Independence Day, notoriously, you're going to have some college kids who are under the age of 21 who are drinking on a beach, and they're going to get caught. Do we want them to have a record? Of course not. So we'll offer them the opportunity to go and clean up the beach the next day, and we start over like it never happened. And that is something I look at for these protest cases, because I do think some people are new to protesting. Our officers may not have encountered it. So we're going to really look at it closely to determine if this is something that takes more or requires more serious response.
Thank you. All right. Let's talk. One of the things that people wanted was reform at the police department. And one of the things that has moved forward rather rapidly, last week we saw the mayor of San Diego endorse a ballot measure that would go on the ballot in November, that would create a more powerful, or at least an agency with a little bit more teeth to investigate misconduct in the police department and use actual subpoena power and use an independent attorney. And I want to bring up a comment. We had Andrea St. Julian on the podcast on Thursday, and she's the co-author of this initiative. And she explained why that independent city attorney was so important. And I wanted to play that clip really quickly.
Okay.
Another example of its lack of independence is that the city attorney is required to be the attorney for the Community Review Board. This is the same city attorney who is the attorney for the police department. All right? So when people look at that, they think, wait a second, how can the attorney whose duty it is to protect the police department properly advise the review board, who supposedly has a duty to make recommendations regarding police conduct?
Yeah, so that was Andrea St. Julian explaining why an independent city attorney or an independent attorney for this body was necessary compared to what exists now. And that's what she was sort of describing. Do you have any response to her point on that? Were you able to provide independent perspective? And is this a vital function of the new agency, new oversight commission?
Yeah, I've talked with Andrea many times about this. And in fact, when I was running for city attorney back in 2016, I thought there is nothing more important than having the public trust the system. And I believe that they should have their own independent counsel. I've long advocated for that. So it's not a legal conflict of interest, but the public looks at it and says, this doesn't feel right, it doesn't look right. And as a law enforcement officer, we have to listen to the public and respond accordingly. And I want them to trust in the system. So we have, my office, since I took over as city attorney, we've always arranged for them to have outside counsel. So I haven't been serving in that role for that very reason. And there's a tortured analysis that you have to go through every year to ensure that they get that budget allocation. And I didn't want them to go through that. I wanted them to have that charter revision. So I couldn't agree with her more on that. I think it's a really important step, and I've been very supportive of that. Our office has worked closely with Council Member Montgomery on this proposal, the Women Occupy proposal that Andrea was talking to you about. And I think it's in a good place. Monica understands her community very well. She knows what her marching orders are. We gave her an attorney from day one to ensure that she had the assistance she needed in evaluating it. And I think it's in a really good place. And it was very encouraging to hear the mayor and the district attorney last week jump aboard. So I think reforms are absolutely necessary. I wish I could endorse it. I cannot, because I have to write the impartial analysis for this measure that's going to go to voters. So what I can do is provide the assistance that they need to get the job done, and it's well on its way.
Okay. But you like it, you just can't endorse it.
Correct.
Fair enough. Well, I wanted to give a shout out to anybody out there. If you have questions for the city attorney, this is the time. Let's put them in there. We'll filter out anything that's a little odd, but anything in there. She's pledged to have a few minutes to talk to you and answer your questions. Again, this is a chance to kind of explain how things work a little bit too for a lot of people who are getting newly engaged in the political and public affairs process at City Hall. Let's make sure you have the right tools to make a difference. So one of the things that you could explain there, this commission, if this ballot measure is implemented, would have subpoena power. What is significant about subpoena power? Can you explain to people what that would mean and how that might make things different for a commission like that?
Well, I think that what the proponents are advocating is that subpoena power would give them another mechanism to get the records that they want to review. And I've heard frustration that an independent body has not been able to look at the records because there are too many impediments to getting them. And I believe, and I'm speaking for Andrea, and she could probably better cover this with you, that they felt that was necessary. And I have heard that the county also has that mechanism. They like it. So that's what they want as well.
Yeah, I think as Andrea pointed out, it probably wouldn't be implemented or executed a lot, the subpoena power, but it would create a sort of a mandate to people being investigated that they should cooperate, because that's sort of underneath. It's always an option. Mm-hmm. And so that's something to consider. Let's help people understand also, this measure had to go through negotiations with labor, with in particular the Police Officers Association, and that was something you had to be a part of too, to understand what happens there, that the Police Officers Association has to be part of that discussion before it can even go to voters.
Yeah, this is a state law under the Myers-Milius-Brown Act, and what it requires is, if you're going to impact the terms and conditions of a government employee, and here there are different mechanisms for discipline. There's a different reviewing body. Then they have an opportunity, if they request it, to meet and confer over the impacts of the proposal. So they can vet everything out. And as you might remember with Prop B, so this is ingrained in our minds because decisions were made about pensions for city employees without city employee involvement. And that was brought as a citizens initiative, but because the mayor and some council members were so involved, they said this is really a city measure. So you should have gone through meet and confer. So we all know that this is very important to the process. And you might recall that back in 2018, that process did not get started soon enough. In this particular case, Councilmember Montgomery very wisely moved it ahead quickly. And those discussions have been happening for a while. The city hires a labor negotiator, so we don't actually serve in that role. And he meets with them and hammers out the proposal that they believe is acceptable. So it ends up becoming a merged proposal with some respects. And Montgomery has been very involved in that. So that's why I believe that this is staying very true to the original intent of the people who put it forward to begin with. And that will eventually get before the voters because the POA has said this looks good to us. The mayor's involved, Montgomery's involved. So I think that we have cleared that hurdle, but that will always be a hurdle when it comes to terms and conditions of employment. And just to get to part two of your question, where does my office become involved with this? We review everything that's going to be placed on the ballot for legality. So once the negotiators come up with what they believe to be the proposal, we'll go through it. We'll make sure it's consistent with the rest of the charter or any municipal code provisions or POBAR, the Police Officer Bill of Rights. So we take a look at it from all those perspectives. But largely at this point, it's been very much the mayor's negotiator, Monica Montgomery, the Police Officers Association. So that probably gives you a little bit of insight into the process to date.
There was a question came up in from Johnny Pappas. He says, how does this ballot measure affect the protections that police have under their collective bargaining agreement? I think I would take a stab and say, basically, this is to update their collective bargaining agreement so that it could incorporate that they now have this potential investigative scrutiny that they have to deal with, right? If it affects their job, then they have to talk about it. And that's where we're at right now, right?
You got it. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Well, hey.
There you go. You're listening.
To the attorney's office. All right. Let's talk about this whole situation. Let's step back. Obviously, this is one of the most significant reforms that the city can do and is doing, pushing forward over the next few months. As you've watched what happened, both with the what happened to George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and all these other names that we're now never going to forget, but then also with the protests and then with the police backlash to the protests, what have you learned as part of the law enforcement process in the region? What have you learned from all of this, and what would you like to see happen based on that?
Well, I have to say that this was a horrific thing, especially as a mother, to watch on television. My children witnessed a murder on news, and it's horrible. And we are trying to figure out, where do we go from here? It led to change, and it's been positive change, but it's just the tip of the iceberg. And I think the message is, there can be, for somebody that's in law enforcement or working in government, you absolutely must have trust in the system. And when there is unequal justice in the system, you do not have that. And we do not have a system that is going to work for all of us. So I think the most important thing you can do is step back and say, hey, this is not going away on its own. We need to fix this. What do we do? And I love the steps that our former President Obama put onto Twitter. I signed off because I think they're very logical. We will review police practices. We will communicate with the public. We will figure out what needs to be fixed. We will report to the public. Very important. But then I think you look inside your own shop to try to figure out, are we part of the problem? Because everybody will have some role in this. And I think that you have to do that. So I've asked I have assistant city attorneys that run various divisions within the office. And I've asked every one of them, really assess our relationships with the police department and figure out, where is it that we need to help? What can we do? Where can we make change? We are working with Stanford up in Northern California, because they've come up with this really neat technology that's being used by the San Francisco district attorney, where it will assess a case and the system figures out whether there's any bias in the rendering of the case. And that's helpful. So they take away the defining characteristics, whether somebody is African American or anything that could be a protected class, to figure out whether or not that is influencing a prosecutorial decision. And we were working on this pre-COVID. It's free technology. They will make it work for the city of San Diego. They have to study us, but it's stuff like that. I also have an advisory group, largely African-American advisory group, that I like to check in with and say, where can we improve? What are you hearing on the streets? And I'll be meeting with them on Friday, and I'm looking forward to hearing what they have to say. The work that we're doing to ensure that there is an independent review body is important. Ensuring there is independent counsel for police review is important. So we're working on all that, but things must change. I must change with it if I need to. So I need to really, I'm looking at this to figure out, where are all the areas that we need to concentrate, because I want people to trust our system. It's really important to the office.
Going along with that, there's been kind of a discussion spreading about this idea of defunding the police, or disbanding the police, or abolishing it. Obviously, that's one end of a pretty big spectrum. But there is this idea that maybe the whole thing should be reimagined, that the whole system should be reimagined and built back up. Is there a room for that? Do you think that the police department is in any way so far out of whack with reform that it just simply cannot be reformed to where it needs to be to deal with these kinds of things, or is it just kind of something on the edges that can be dealt with?
I don't think it's so far that it can't be reformed. I think the number one thing we must do as law enforcement is talk to the communities and figure out where the trust has been breached. Some of it's so obvious. When you see George Floyd murdered, obviously that's not going to build trust. But within our own police department, where's the trust being broken? And I think when there's a call for defunding police, I don't think people mean it that way. I think that when we are robbed or raped or abused by a domestic partner, we need to call the police department. People know that. I think what they're trying to say is our police department cannot do this by itself. And there are other ways we can approach these really important issues that don't entail force or incarceration. Perhaps it's more economic opportunity in certain neighborhoods. Maybe it's better parks. Maybe it's more attention to the schools. And it's kind of like with teachers. I've seen this with my own kids. Teachers have now become parents and caretakers and nutritionists, and they're helping you with special ed, and they're working during their lunch breaks. And I think we're seeing a lot of that happen to our police force because they're not necessarily trained on somebody who's having a psychotic breakdown and not to be trained or treated by someone who has that knowledge. I mean, you've got someone that's giving a ticket on one day and talking someone down from the roof of a building who wants to kill themselves the next day. And that needs to be addressed. And I think that's where we've gotten so far away from what law enforcement was intended to do, which is protect us.
So there was a question that came in about this incident, and I feel it might be something that every public official in the city needs to sort of grapple with, was this question of a woman who was pulled off the street. She was a protester. She was kind of pushed into an unmarked van, and then ominously, the people who took her, they weren't even very well identified, said, "You follow us, you'll get shot." Do you have a reaction to that video? It seems to have really struck a nerve in San Diego. Georgette Gomez demanded, she's city council president, an immediate investigation. Is that something you would investigate? How would that currently work in this situation, and how might it work in the future?
Yeah, I would not investigate it, but I did see the video. I've read the account of what happened. It's horrific. And I can't imagine being the person who was pulled off the streets and put into an unmarked vehicle by someone that didn't appear to be law enforcement. I second that motion. I know that the chief is looking into it and it needs to be addressed. How does it come back to our office? I would look at something like this and say, how did this happen? Can we unfold this? Is there training? Are there policies that need to be in place? So we take that type of an angle, but we would not be the ones who are prosecuting an officer for that.
Yeah. Well, keep your questions coming. I'm going to start to switch topics a little bit. Obviously, this was such an important thing. I wanted to make sure we spent some time on what the discussion was going. But there's some big issues that have been going on. One is, let's talk about this measure that might also be on the November ballot that would change the city attorney's role in the city of San Diego. I haven't had a chance to ask you about it. This would say that if voters approved, the city attorney would continue with that prosecutorial role over misdemeanors, but the role of advising and litigating on behalf of the city would go to an appointed city attorney, somebody more responsive, they say, to the city council and the mayor. When you were running for city attorney, I remember you were the only one sort of open to the idea that the role shouldn't necessarily be an elected role. Things have obviously changed a lot since then. So I'm curious what you think about that measure. Would obviously have an impact on your future, or I don't know when it would be implemented. Maybe you can help us understand it.
Yeah, I'm not sure either. I don't have a lot of insight to what is behind this. What we did is we arranged for the 4 council members to have outside counsel. So I have removed myself from that. I find it anti-democratic. I think at this time when the public wants accountability more than ever, they're out on the streets and they are talking directly to their public officials, me included, that this is the wrong way to say to the public, we hear you. The reason is I can tell you that if somebody doesn't like what I do, they let me know and I can reassess what our priorities are. We might rethink how we handle certain cases. I've had an ability to talk directly to the public on very complicated matters, whereas, and I worked at the county, we never issued public memos. The attorneys didn't go to the Board of Supervisor meetings. I mean, it's a very different thing. There's a lot of transparency in the way that the city attorney's office is set up. And I think there was a lot of wisdom. And when you look back at the implementing documents that people voted on when they were trying to decide if they wanted an independent or an appointed city attorney, they very clearly said, we want someone who is going to be committed to protecting the public's interests, not to the 9 or whatever number of council members they had, those politicians who are appointing that person. It was really important to have that level of accountability. And I do recall that conversation I had with you back in 2015. I hadn't had the job. It's very different when you've lived the job. And there's times that I have said things that I've been told not to say. I have spoken up when I've been asked to be silent. And that is the importance. Let's just look at SDSU. We were given a one-sided deal on May 5th that was not good for the city. And there was enormous pressure for me to sign that. We need the money. We want this deal done. It's taking too long. And I and my team looked at it and said, this is really bad for the city. We don't want to sign this. And I was able to fight and make sure that we got a fair and balanced deal that really protects the taxpayers. So for me, this is not where our city is going. I think the people who live in our city want the right to speak up. If they do not like how I am doing my job, they want the right to fire me, directly fire me by not voting for me again. Yeah. So I think the system works. I learned it through the experience of being city attorney.
Well, right now you do have a rival running against you. His name is Corey Briggs. He did make the argument. Let's talk about that for a second. It was as you described it, the largest and most complex land use deal in the city of San Diego's history. It's been more or less done. Obviously, there's a lot of paperwork your office is doing to make sure that the transfer of land from the city of San Diego to San Diego State University in Mission Valley can go forward. I think any other time, this would be one of the biggest stories of the summer. Obviously, this is kind of a minor blip in a weird way because of all these different things happening internationally and locally. But again, largest, most complex land use deal in the city of San Diego's history. And Corey Briggs, who's running against you, he said that you're trying to tank the deal because you've been hostile to the deal for a long time. You had some legal concerns about Measure G, which sort of put it in motion. You didn't feel like Measure G legally was appropriate as far as how it affected the decisions that city officials were forced to make underneath it. But the city council didn't agree with you, didn't want to pursue that case. I think that left the impression that you were hostile to the entire deal. Everyone praised you for your effort after it started to get all these votes for the major points of it after all these negotiations. But then there was Barbara Bree, and she said, she's running for mayor. She's a city council member. She said, here we are 18 months later after that initial sort of deal point, or after the Measure G was passed, after another series of closed-door negotiations from which the public and city council have been excluded. That is not the way government should operate. Did you have any response to her on that?
I think that we saw that the public appreciates that they have a city attorney who will protect them, because I will attest to this, the pressure was intense for months. And I read many personal attacks that I was trying to kill the deal. But those who understood the complexity of this negotiation, and we're talking about land that has been with the city for decades. This is land we use for emergency evacuations. Those who lived through the fires were stationed there. We're using that facility for our pure water recycling project. We need to access that property after it's sold. We also this is an as-is deal. So the city, the taxpayers, those who voted, sent a strong message that after this is over, we don't want to hear about it. This is an as-is deal. So my job is to make sure we're not going to find 10 years from now that we didn't deal with some of the details that were really important. For instance, we might have been responsible for paying prevailing wages for SDSU's contractors had we not fixed the language that was in the May 5th deal, or contracts that they entered into with third parties. It's possible that the city would have been roped in. So there was a lot of complexity. I think I was disappointed with some of the council members who have business backgrounds that they didn't look at this deal for what it was. It's not like selling your house. And I think those who took the time to read the documents, and I have to say this was the most transparent negotiation in the city's history. And we went to great pains to continue to show the public, here's what the document looks like. Okay, here's what we've negotiated. Now this is what it looks like. It was a lot of extra work, and we were happy to do that because we want the public to be confident that they're getting a fair and equitable deal that's protective of their interests later. Chargers ticket guarantee, for instance. When we don't think ahead, the taxpayer gets burned. And I did not want that to happen. I got to add one more thing here. Ultimately, the council votes on this. So my actions were to protect them because they, under Measure G, are responsible for making a determination at a public hearing that this deal is fair, equitable, and in the public interest. And I didn't want them to say that when I knew the deal was not good. So I took a lot of heat for protecting their decision-making process and protecting the public. And I think, years from now, people will look back and say, hey, this went pretty well, and we're proud of what happened here on this land.
Yeah. Can you help explain what major changes from that May 5th deal were implemented?
Yeah, so we issued a memo explaining that there were 14 really big deal points. And that didn't mean that that was everything we saw wrong with the document. You might remember with this transaction, SDSU gave us their version and said, here, sign this one. So anytime the other party gives you their version, it's usually stacked up against you. So we went through this and broke it down so the council could understand, here's 14 issues that are really important. One of your priorities is the pure water project. And if we cannot secure what we need from this, and that's our recycled water project, it'll provide about a third of the city's water by 2035. And it's been an important thing. If we don't fix this, we're not going to be able to do this project. We wanted to ensure access to the river park. That was really important. We have wells that we need to continue to use. We also have city land we need to continue to access because there were plans in place long before this measure, and there's an expectation we're going to get certain operational things done. There's some environmental contamination issues from the past that we believe to be resolved, but we didn't want to be responsible for that because this is an as-is sale. And when you do your appraisal, you're pretty familiar with everything you're buying. So my job was really a nice, clean break in a fair way so that we all can move forward without feeling like we were really selling out. So that probably gives you a good idea of some of the importance of what we were fighting over.
Yeah. It does seem like there were a number of concessions and some late night discussions. Mara, I got a bunch of texts that you time was up. Did you have any other thoughts about the state of the city right now and things you would want people to understand about what's happening with it?
Well, I think the closing thought is that the protests, I believe, have brought about a conversation that has not happened, probably for my entire life. And the results are meaningful. I encourage the public to continue to speak to us. I will continue to speak to the public because trust is the most important thing we can have as public officials. I was watching the budget hearings before we jumped on Facebook, and we had well over 100 people who wanted to speak out about the importance of a budget. And they're right, because it is a reflection of the values you have as a city. And we need to hear from the public. I think what we're seeing with the protests is that somewhere along the way, government stopped hearing. And it is more important than ever for us to start that communication process again and really hear from the people that we represent and change when we need to change. And I suspect a lot of change is coming.
Mara Elliott, the city attorney at the city of San Diego, thank you for taking the time today. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Scott. Take care.
You too. All right. Well, we have a lot going on the website today. You can check it out. We've got some great stories about the future of transportation. Also, I wanted to shout out tomorrow afternoon, 2 p.m. on KPBS on their platforms on Facebook and YouTube and such. They're going to have a discussion with Richard Barrera, the vice president of the board of the San Diego Unified School District, and Ashley Lewis, a San Diego Unified School District parent, also happens to be my wife, and a 17-year-old high school student. Will talk about the future of schools. I hope you can check it out there. Thank you all for joining, and we will talk to you again on Wednesday.